After what happened to Charlie Kirk, lots of people left and right have been trying to get their takes out into the discourse, including myself. But not all discourse is the same, and not all of it is based in facts. The right, for their part, have been taking this opportunity to try and sell a narrative that they're desperate for people to believe. That the left is more violent than the right. More specifically, that the majority of political violence in the US comes from the left, with people on the right being their victims.
And the violence comes largely from the left. You don't hear that from too many people, do you?
And if there was ever a time to try and sell this narrative, it would be now, when a very famous right-wing influencer did just die in a gruesome way, on video for the whole internet to see. It is the perfect story for them. Look at this innocent man, spreading conservative values with his own free speech, attacked and killed by the left because they couldn't beat him in the free marketplace of ideas. But there is still just one little problem with this narrative that the right cannot escape. They don't have any facts. Notice that whenever these politicians and talking heads on the right try and tell you that the majority of political violence comes from the left, they conveniently don't present any evidence. They just say it, and then they move on. But as we all know, just saying something by itself isn't a good argument. I mean, as someone on the left, I can just say plenty of things too, right? So how do we know who's right and who's wrong? Well, we look at the facts. And as it turns out, the right has a lot of good reasons to not just not show facts, but to actively try and hide them from their audience. And this is because the evidence overwhelmingly shows one thing, that the majority of political violence in the United States comes from the right. People on the right not only commit more violent acts, those acts result in more fatalities. Now, not everyone knows about this, but I'll tell you who does know about this. The right, specifically Trump's own administration, which is why they've tried to hide and erase some of the information I'm going to show you here today. So in this video, I'm going to go over just some of the facts that prove that the right is the largest source of political violence in the United States. Then I'm going to discuss why, despite the facts being so clear and publicly available, most Americans still don't know the truth about this. This is yet another story about how well the right wing is able to dominate discourse and take control of narratives, even without facts on their side, and how the complicit mainstream media helps with this. So with that, let's begin. Let's start by simply going over the facts of the matter. How do we actually answer the question of whether people on the left or the right commit more political violence? What kind of information and evidence can we look at? Well, it turns out that many reputable organizations, from independent think tanks on the left and the right, and government agencies have looked into this, and they've made their findings and sources publicly available, even if the right is trying to take some of it down. Here's what I need you to know. The information that I'm about to show you comes from a variety of different organizations with different political affiliations, different organizational structures, and different methodologies and datasets. So the absolute numbers might change between different reports, but there is one very important thing that they all agree on. Right-wing violence is the greatest ongoing domestic terror threat in the United States, and it has been for decades. Right-wing violence is consistently shown to not just be more common, but more deadly, being higher in both number and fatalities than political violence from the left. Now, before we get into the actual data, I want to make one thing very clear. I am a person whose beliefs are on the left, and I believe that political violence is unacceptable. As we are about to see, the scale and extent of right-wing violence makes left-wing violence look minuscule, but that is not an excuse for the relatively small amount of fatalities caused by left-wing violence. The only acceptable number of fatalities caused by people on the left is 0. With that, let's get into the data. Now, I'm anticipating that some conservatives will watch this video and try and dismiss all the data I gathered by saying that my sources are all biased and left-wing. So I'm going to start by presenting a report from the Cato Institute, a libertarian right-leaning think tank created by one of the Koch brothers for the self-described goal of promoting small government and free markets. The report that we're looking at goes over data tracking political violence from 1975 up to the present, and the author doesn't go out of their way to point out the differences in the numbers between left-wing and right-wing violence, but the data they show says it all for them. This Cato Institute report finds that politically motivated terrorism from the right resulted in 391 deaths, while politically motivated terrorism from the left resulted in 65. Again, that is 65 too many, but that is 6 times as many fatalities from right-wing terrorism versus left-wing. In fact, the report goes on to show that if you don't count 9/11, right-wing terror fatalities outnumber Islamic terrorism and left-wing terrorism combined. And by the way, I consider Islamism to also be a right-wing ideology. But hey, this is just one study. I can see someone asking for a second opinion. Maybe there's some problem with this report. So let's look at a report that's not from a think tank, but was written by the FBI and the DHS working together, which was presented to multiple committees in Congress in 2021. It goes over data about domestic terrorism from 2015 to 2019. Why 2015? That's when the FBI switched to an electronic crime tracking system, making data starting that year more reliable. Now, since this is a government agency writing, they don't divide perpetrators into partisan labels like left and right, but they divided them up into different categories based on their beliefs and motives, and I think we can reasonably split them between left and right based on these. The report separates violent extremists into the following key categories: racially or ethnically motivated, such as white supremacists. Then there's anti-government and anti-authority, which has 3 subgroups. There are militia extremists who believe that the government is overreaching with their authority, often focused on opposing gun regulations. These are all groups associated with the right. Then there are what the report calls anarchists, opposed to all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and oppressive government institutions. I think we can safely put this group on the left. Then there are sovereign citizens. I think it's safe to say that these are on the right. Then there are environmental and animal rights extremists. We can put these on the left. Then there are abortion relation extremists. The report puts extremists both for and against abortion in the same category, so we'll have to look at the specifics. So what does the report say? In every year that the report covered, the picture remains the same. The vast majority of fatal domestic terror attacks in every year came from racially motivated violent extremists. And the report even says that the threat is from white supremacist extremists, specifically. In most years, the remaining fatalities are caused by militia or sovereign citizen extremists. In 2015, there were 3 fatalities caused by an abortion extremist, but this was a person who was very against abortion, so they're on the right as well. Now, how about left-leaning groups, the anti-capitalist anarchists and the environmental extremists? In the years covered in this report, there are no reported deaths caused by them. 0. I'll say it again. In this report, there are no deaths attributed to anti-capitalist anarchist extremists or to environmental and animal rights extremists. Don't get me wrong, the report doesn't say that these groups aren't dangerous and that they aren't a problem. In fact, it explicitly says the opposite. But it does say that these groups tend to cause economic and property damage. They just don't cause fatalities. But fine, maybe one government source isn't enough for you. And this report did only go through a few years, so let me give you another government source. A report from the NIJ that goes over political violence in the US from 1990 to 2024. And you know this one's good, because the Trump administration made sure to pull this report specifically from the NIJ website. Seriously, I already knew about this report even before I started writing this video, so when I went back to get a copy of it, I found that you can't access it anymore. You just get redirected to the NIJ homepage when you try. When I found news articles reporting on the same thing, I realized it wasn't just me. Trump and his administration really just wiped it from the internet, because they can. Luckily for us, the Wayback Machine exists, which is how I was still able to get a copy. So what's in this report, and why does the right not want you to see it? Well, the report draws on multiple government-run databases that track crime and terrorism in the US, and the findings are clearly stated and pretty stark. I'll cut to the chase. In this report, the totals show that far-right violence has caused 227 attacks, resulting in 520 deaths. Far-left violence has been responsible for 42 attacks and 78 deaths. Again, yet another study that shows that right-wing violence is both more frequent and more deadly. And just to hammer it home, a think tank called New America published a report tracking fatalities caused by extremists after 9/11, and the tally stands at 139 fatalities caused by right-wing extremists and 3 caused by left-wing extremists. Hell, we can bump it up to 4 if you want to count what happened to Charlie Kirk. It doesn't change the picture much. Then we have this report from the ADL. Not exactly a friend of the left if you've been paying attention lately, but they make it pretty clear. Right-wing extremists are responsible for the vast majority of extremist-related murders over the past decade. The report even specifies that left-wing extremism does exist and is a problem, but consistent with the FBI DHS report, they usually target property rather than people. So to summarize, we have a bunch of different reports and studies coming from different organizations or different political persuasions, using different terminology and sources to study the same problem, and they all present the same picture. Like I said at the beginning, the absolute numbers might be different from report to report, but the overall picture remains the same between all of them. Right-wing violence not only happens more often than left-wing violence, it's more harmful, resulting in vastly more fatalities and more often deliberately targets people over property. So I'm expecting reactionaries who don't like what they're seeing here to leave comments under this video, dismissing all of the data that I just showed you by accusing all of my sources of being biased or ideologically driven. And you know what? I'll give it to you that some of them probably are. But here's the thing, I went out of my way to collect data from a variety of different sources from different political leanings to try and present as unbiased a picture as possible. I'm posting links to all these reports below the video. These reports and studies tell you how they analyze their data and what data sets they're using. If you don't like the results that they found, you're welcome to go look at their data for yourself and try and point out problems, and to try to do a better job yourself. In fact, I encourage you to do that. But I'm sorry, it is not a convincing argument to stand in the face of all this research and simply try and hand wave it away with vibes. And if you do look into the data trying to find issues with it, and you find that no matter where you look, all the data keeps pointing to a conclusion that disagrees with you, try and consider that maybe it's not a giant conspiracy between all the data sets and organizations trying to get you. Maybe it's just that reality itself is saying that you're wrong, and that you should change your mind. But in the interest of fairness, there is one more report I want to go over. You see, a few months ago, the CSIS released a report with a headline that caught a lot of attention. Whoa, what's this? Left-wing violence is now more common than right-wing violence? Left-wing violence is now at the highest levels in 30 years? What's going on? Does this disprove all the other data that I just showed? Have I been owned just now? Well, that's how some on the right and in the mainstream media have been framing this report, but let's see what it really says. First of all, yes, the report does show that left-wing violence is in fact more common than right-wing violence in the first half of 2025, meaning that for every other period of time before that, right-wing violence was more common. Oh, but what about left-wing violence being at the highest rate it's been in 30 years? Yes, it is. Left-wing violence went up from 4 incidents a year up to the staggering 30-year high of 5 incidents a year. 6 if you count Charlie Kirk. Yeah, that's right. The big headline out of this report, the crazy new 30-year high of left-wing violence that the media is talking about, is because left-wing violence went up from 4 incidents a year to 5 this year. Meanwhile, the same report shows that from 1994 to 2024, right-wing violent incidents have consistently been around 20 incidents a year. The only reason why left-wing violence is more common than right-wing violence for this 1 year is because right-wing violence suddenly dropped from its usual high levels, and because left-wing violence is usually so rare that even the smallest increase represents a record high. According to this very report, it's not that left-wing violence is reaching new crazy heights that outpaces right-wing violence, it's that right-wing violence suddenly dropped this year. But still, that leaves the question, what explains the sudden drop in right-wing violence in 2025? Indeed, the report cites only one example of right-wing violence from this year, the murder of Melissa Hortman and her husband, and the topic of one of my recent videos. Well, one reasonable guess would be that the right wing, even the extreme right wing, feels very satisfied with what's going on right now with the current administration currently in power. And this is the same hypothesis that the authors of this report propose, that right-wing violence is lower right now because they're satisfied. They even quote a Proud Boys leader as saying, "What is there to complain about right now?" But before any right-wingers watching this video start to celebrate, I would warn you that this might not be the win that you think it is. Recall the research I showed earlier that showed that the biggest source of political violence in the United States comes from white supremacist extremists, people who believe in the superiority of the white race. Well, according to the numbers, these people haven't been acting up this year like they usually do every other year. And if white supremacists stop acting out because they're so satisfied with the actions of the current administration that they no longer feel they need to take action, doesn't that confirm the left's criticism that Trump's policies are, in fact, racist? If Trump's administration is apparently so pleasing to the most extreme white supremacists in the country, isn't that kind of a damning sign as to what the intent and effect of its policies are? So yeah, That's the story. Left-wing violence is now more common than right-wing violence in the first half of 2025, because right-wing violence suddenly dropped when Trump took office, and because left-wing violence went up from 4 incidents a year to 5 or 6 incidents this year. Yet that hasn't stopped some conservatives and the complicit mainstream media from framing this report as new evidence of a crazy apocalyptic surge of left-wing violence. Among the people sharing this article as evidence of left-wing violence was Senator John Fetterman. Jesus, what happened to this guy? Actually, don't answer that question. Anyway, let's switch gears and talk about media analysis. It should be pretty clear by now that all the facts and research are very unambiguous, that political violence in the United States overwhelmingly comes from the right. That is simply a fact, and a simple Google search will show you a variety of different sources, all independently coming to the same conclusion. So that leaves us with another question. Why don't most people know this? A Marquette Law poll published just this month found that when asked whether left-wing or right-wing violence is a bigger problem, 27% of respondents said left-wing violence, 22% said right-wing violence, and 51% of respondents think that both sides are equally to blame. We need to take a step back and really let this settle in. We just looked at a stack of research that showed over and over again that right-wing violence outnumbers left-wing violence in frequency and severity multiple times over. Yet when asked which is the bigger problem, only 22% of the people polled responded correctly. This is a problem, and it says a lot about our media environment and how thoroughly the right has been able to control narratives, even without the facts on their side. And it's a big reason why we're in the current moment that we're in, so let's talk about why this is the case. The first reason is very simple. The media doesn't talk about this. Of course, right-wing media is never going to touch this data, but the mainstream media isn't really much better. Seriously, how often do you really hear this information brought up on mainstream media? Almost never. And it's not like the mainstream media doesn't ever cover violence done by right-wingers, but they just don't take care to painstakingly debunk right-wing narratives in the way that I just did. The most they'll do is a quick perfunctory statement saying this or that statement from Trump or someone else is unsubstantiated without going into more detail. If the right successfully makes enough noise, makes enough of a spectacle of something like the Kirk story, the media is so weak and so afraid of being accused of being the liberal media that they essentially allow the right to set the narrative for them. The media shifts its coverage towards what the right wants from them, and the very real stories of right-wing violence are quickly forgotten by the public. And this is a big reason why the public is so misled on this topic. The right markets their strategies and capitalizes on them, and the left doesn't. I'm going to illustrate this dynamic with an example, one that we should all be familiar with by now, comparing how the right responded to the deaths of Melissa Hortman and her husband at the hands of a right-wing assassin, and how they responded to the death of Charlie Kirk. I did cover these events in my last 2 videos, so apologies for recycling content, but I'm only covering the parts that are relevant to this video. If you want more details on what I'm discussing, please go ahead and check out those videos of mine. I'll link them down below as well. June of this year, Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot and killed by an assassin with a long history of espousing right-wing beliefs, who had a hit list in his car of Democratic politicians and abortion providers. The gunman also shot John Hoffman and his wife, but they ended up surviving. So we have a case of 2 lawmakers and their spouses, both of them Democratic lawmakers, being shot, 2 of them losing their lives, and the perpetrator was clearly on the right and with political motives. What was the response from the right? As I detailed in my last video, what we got from the White House was an online post from Trump, who did call the shooting terrible, but didn't mention the names of the victims, and he doesn't identify the ideology of the shooter either. Very convenient for him. Trump even refused to call Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, about it, saying that it would have been a waste of time. Now, what happened when Charlie Kirk got shot? Trump not only put out a personal or possibly AI video statement about it, he put out an official White House statement honoring Charlie Kirk in his capacity as the president. He had the flags at the White House flown at half-staff, which is typically done for major national tragedies, and something that was not done for Melissa Hortman and her husband. Oh, and of course, he made sure to blame the left for it all. Then the right held a memorial service for him, filling up a stadium, with Trump walking out in front of the crowd accompanied by freaking fireworks. Now here's why I bring this up. The complete difference between how the right responded to the 2 events is not just another case of their hypocrisy. It is actually their strategy, and it is a good example of how they control the narrative. Remember that clip I showed you where Trump says that most of the political violence comes from the left? Yeah, he said that at the stadium memorial with the fireworks. And of course, Trump didn't cite any sources or present any facts for it. He couldn't if he wanted to, but he didn't need to. The grandiosity of the event, the pure spectacle of it, that was the argument. The bombast and scenery of the event was meant to magnify Charlie's death into something everyone could see and feel viscerally. Charlie was just one person. Melissa Hortman and her husband were two. In theory, what happened to them was the greater crime, an even bigger loss of life. But the right knows that for most people, that won't matter, as long as the only thing they hear about it is a quick news blurb and an obligatory social media post. But if they can magnify Charlie Kirk's death into a national tragedy that immerses the screens and minds of people, they will feel that Charlie's was the much bigger tragedy and the bigger loss of life. That's why Trump can get away with saying that most of the violence comes from the left. It doesn't matter that I can dispassionately prove him wrong with stacks of actual studies and statistics. The pure bombast of the scenery around him is meant to emotionally imprint the truth of his statement onto the audience, and it works. As I said in my last video, the right understands a truth about the age of mass media better than the left does. Appearances are reality. They know that if they can get people to simply hear and see about something over and over again, even if it is literally just the one same incident, they will believe that it's something that happens more often than it really does. This is a well-studied psychological phenomenon, and it even has a name, the availability heuristic. When it's easier to recall something, if we have more vivid memories of something, we believe that it is more common or more severe than it really is. It's why people think that plane crashes and shark attacks are more common than they really are. And of course, the right couldn't do this without the help of the complicit media. In their constant quest for fake neutrality, and their fear of being accused of being biased against the right, they repeat and amplify whatever the right decides will be the narrative for the day, legitimizing it and doing the right's dirty work for them. Just look at the example of that one study that found that there was more left-wing violence than right-wing violence for the first half of this year. All that happened was that left-wing violence had 1 or 2 more incidents than usual, and right-wing violence suddenly dropped with this new administration. That's all that happened. But the mainstream media picked it up and ran with it, with headlines that stripped away all context, making it look like there's this new, sudden frenzy of left-wing violence that's this new, huge problem. Meanwhile, did these same publications run articles every other year about how there are 5 times as many violent right-wing incidents as left-wing ones? Did they run articles about how right-wing violence was more common and more lethal that year, just like it was for every other year before 2025? No, they didn't. They just wrote stories about the one isolated data point that makes it seem like the left is more violent. That's why most Americans don't know the truth about this. That's how the right has been able to and continues to bury the facts. So what do we do to combat this? Well, I believe that the left needs to learn to play this game too. And what I'm hoping is that this video can contribute to figuring out what that looks like. After all, knowing is half the battle, and we have to know how this game works. The big difference, of course, is that we can actually do this with the truth. We don't need to substitute facts with showmanship and spectacle. We can just show the facts. But perhaps that's actually been a weakness for the left, and for the pro-science people trying to combat stuff like the anti-vaccine movement, which, yes, is a reactionary movement and is in power right now. We assume that the truth can speak for itself, that convincingly making a case is enough, and it should be enough, but that is not the world we live in. We live in a world with a complicit media who either doesn't know or doesn't care about how the right wing is playing them. Where even if people don't get their news from cable news, they get it from social media, where the algorithms are practically designed to amplify right-wing rage bait. We need to realize that the truth will not just speak for itself, and it's not fair, but the progressive left needs to overcome these structural barriers with effort, and that means not just stating the truth, but stating it over and over again with lots of style if you can. To that end, I'll be pasting links to all of these reports and studies that I cited in this video, along with a few extra down below. I hope this video can be a resource to help us know what the actual facts are and be able to communicate them to others. I know that just this by itself is not enough, but I hope it's a start. A topic I'm planning on developing much more as my channel goes along is the idea of a unified and cooperative left-leaning online media space, where creators and audiences can effectively communicate and work together to constructively try and take back the media space and algorithmic territory from the right. The last time I think we did this very well was back in 2019 with what was called BreadTube. This is a topic that I will develop more in a future video. Obviously, I cannot bring this about all by myself with my relatively small channel. I'm not saying that I'm going to be the leader of this new movement. I just want to put the idea out there so that hopefully the broader community can discuss it and start to develop it more. But I'll leave that to a future video. So, those are the facts. And as they say, facts don't care about your feelings. But the right understands just as well that you don't have to deal with facts if you don't see them. And they and the complicit media are very good at making sure that people do not see them. We have to beat them, and we can do it with the truth. Well, thank you so much for watching all of that. If you liked it and found it helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. If you really like what I do and want to help me start doing this full time, as I would like to, please consider checking out my Patreon. I'm about to revamp my benefit tiers in order to offer more personalized perks for patrons. If that's something that interests you, I hope you'll take a look. In any case, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.